we are on air, apparently. So,
Okay. Well, that's fine. We're ready, I guess.
so the the reason why I wanted to talk to you 20 minutes beforehand is so that we could figure out who's going to talk about which comments first. But I guess we'll just figure it out as we go.
I'm a teacher. I'm used to this improvisation of, I'm used to things going wrong.
Yeah. Let's see here. If I hold on, there's one other thing I need to check, and
I'll open up the comments that I have.
okay, yeah. If I have to stare at myself while I'm talking, apparently. So the main purpose of today's thing, everybody, is that we are doing a bit of a comments response. I was planning on making this kind of a semi-regular thing, because there's often a lot of comments worth responding to, and especially since we did that collab, we have two comment sections to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can do a bit of a Q&A after we get through that.
All right.
So let's just how much time? We got like 10 minutes before people are actually going to be joining.
There's already 43 people, so we might as well start it now. And
okay. Well, I think the most common comment I had was Texans talking about specifically this is about the Texas versus New Mexico, and Matt's video of Kansas versus Missouri. And on my video, there were a lot of Texans just kind of going like, what? They didn't even realize there was a rivalry there.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, a lot of these things are kind of one-sided. Yours isn't, though.
No. I think a lot of people are already aware of kind of bleeding Kansas, the idea that before the American Civil War, there was kind of this precursor, and some historians even argue the Civil War started in Kansas. But I don't think a lot of people realized how bad it was, because most American history curriculums kind of just, give it like we're going to look at this today, one day, and here's the highlights, and all right. But if you really look at everything, it's pretty incredible almost how just the hatred on both sides, and it did kind of carry over, I think, all the way to the present, and sports kind of helped with that, with the University of Kansas and University of Missouri rivalry. Although
Don't
now
they
that
call that the border war?
yeah, the border war.
Mm-hmm.
The only reason why the rivalry hasn't really been kept alive in very recent years is because Missouri went to the SEC conference, or SEC, and the University of Kansas is still in Big 12. So I think the rivalry has waned a little bit because of that, but still, you got, especially near the border. People commented on my video who lived, in St. Louis, or maybe they lived in Western Kansas, and they're like, "What rivalry are you talking about?" But in terms of Eastern Kansas, Western Missouri, definitely that's still there underlying.
Yeah, and I think especially in Kansas City, either side.
Yeah, and Kansas City has grown steadily in recent decades, and so you have an influx of people from other places that now live there, myself included, I guess, because I'm originally from Wichita. So like that, I don't think even there. Like I posted my video on the Kansas City subreddit on Reddit just to see if they'd be into it, and for the most part, they were pretty indifferent. Like, if anything, it's like they just talk about, well, Kansas driver. In Kansas, they don't know how to drive, or in Missouri,
That seems to always be the basis of a rivalry is like
yeah,
everybody complains about each other's drivers, and I hear New Mexicans talking about Texas drivers like, oh, the Texas drivers are so bad, and um, first of all, I'm not a New Mexican, so I get to be like extra kind of like, nope, not my fight, but drivers here suck, like like I think Texan drivers are actually better. Like, I know that's sacrilege where I'm standing, but like, it's when I came here, there was I was driving my Jeep around, had California license plates, and the people would like pass me and then like cut me off like incessantly. And I'm not a slow driver at all. I drive like 5 miles over the speed limit like everybody. Um, but they'd be like zooming around me and cutting me off like I'm the slowest person in traffic. And I thought, okay, it's because I got foreign plates. Sure. But as soon as I got New Mexican plates, suddenly they're still doing it. And it's like, oh, this place is just full of a bunch of idiots. And it's like, I'm not used to this. Like, I've driven plenty in LA. LA's got some of the worst drivers in America, but like these people on average are worse than LA drivers. And that's saying something, you know?
yeah, but everybody thinks they're the best driver ever, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh,
Although I
Frederick
mean,
kicks in.
I had a hard lesson in that when I moved back to San Luis Obispo. Um, I hadn't really driven there like my entire life, and I moved from Vegas to San Luis Obispo, and like, I mean, how small towns drive, right? They're careful and cautious,
Yeah,
and like they're just
it's
good drivers.
it's more laid back. I live in a yeah. Lawrence is where I live. It's about 100,000 people, and people
Yeah.
are more likely at a stop sign to like go ahead. No, you go ahead. Whereas in Kansas City, it's like, no, I'm going.
Although I prefer the more aggressive kind of stop sign because like when you get in, like when the other person has the right of way and they still want to give you it's just like, no, just go, just go, it's the law.
Yeah, give me my roundabout. I love roundabouts.
Kind of.
If you know how to use them.
Yeah. And also if they're there to slow people down rather than like in San Luis Obispo, they have ones that are specifically designed to slow you down. They replace places where there was no stop sign or light or anything like that. They just replaced it with a roundabout because people were driving, oh my god, 30 miles an hour in a 25. Um, but I mean, that's the small town kind of driver, right? They are cautious and careful and like drive. I mean, they tend to drive over the speed limit too, but it's like they're not incessantly doing it and not demanding that everybody else drive like 15 miles over the speed limit.
Yeah, there's less stress. I mean, that's what it comes down to. When you're not as stressed as much with your life, I think you're not as in a hurry as much. Plus, you don't have very far to go. You're just like,
Yeah,
oh,
that's true.
it's a 15-minute commute everywhere. It's like this is lovely. Like,
Although I
boy,
mean, in slow, I often ended up having to go up the grade or down to the Five Cities area, which is all like 15 to 30 miles away, or Morro Bay and Los Osos, and I miss
okay.
being in slow. But the you often end up driving to like other towns because like you know you're not going to get in and out and slow, so you got to go down to freaking some other place, and that's like a 15-minute drive, 20-minute drive, but you have to get on the freeway. And so you get exposed to like other people, and you can always tell if they're from out of town because they're kind of like, as soon as the ocean comes by and it's this like really pretty vista where you're like, you take the road's turning left and you're just kind of like going with the flow. I always got in the right lane so that I could like see it, and I'm in a Jeep, so like no doors or anything. And but you can always tell people who suddenly like realize where they are and they'd like veer all the way across the highway just to be like, oh, look at the pretty sight.
Yeah.
And it was like that was one of the few times that you had to be wary of like out of towners because they didn't know how to handle that one spot.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, I saw some comments about people like saying like, "Oh, Texas has the worst drivers," and like I'm
Yeah.
from New Mexico and I hate it when they come over here. Roswell is like inundated with these fools, and I'm just kind of going like, "Well, try driving in Albuquerque." Because
Well,
Roswell's pretty small.
yeah, but I think it's a universal thing. You know, whoever is the next town over, the next state over, they're the ones who are the worst drivers. So,
Yeah, I always hear Nevadans talking about like Utah having horrible drivers and having driven in Utah plenty. It's like, they tend to be better than most Nevadans.
yeah, you're more objective. How about that? It helps if you lived in multiple states. Like you lived in 3 states, right? So plus
Oh
you
yeah.
were in the military, so you were all over the world. So
Yeah, I also I mean states in which I've driven in is like 30. Um
oh wow, yeah.
so like I've actually driven in Kansas. But the
Yeah, I've traveled a little bit. The only other state I've lived in was Nebraska. I had an interesting question about that actually, because somebody, and you might have an opinion about this, but somebody was like, "Well, why didn't you see the same kind of violence in Nebraska that you saw in Kansas um, during the Bleeding Kansas?" And my initial impulse is that, well, Nebraska was west of Iowa, which is a free state. Kansas just right there with Missouri, Missouri being a slave state. So for practicality, you're going to have people just like stepping over the border. I mean, that's.
yeah.
Can you think of any other reasons why Nebraska didn't see any violence?
Well, you also have to think how long it took for Nebraska to actually become a state.
Yeah,
I think it's like 1874, something like
yeah, it
that.
was a good. Yeah, it was like 50, yeah.
Because
So
I mean, there
12
just
years
wasn't
after
that much of a
Kansas.
population influx as what happened with Kansas. I mean, yeah, a
Well,
lot
but the
of the movement
population,
for Kansas was political, but like
right?
much of it was just people wanting to take advantage of new land, and they happened to be slavers.
Yeah.
Slave owners.
Slave owners. Yeah, I know what you meant. But yeah, like if you look at the very first few weeks after Kansas was declared a territory after the Kansas Nebraska Act, um, nobody was going to Nebraska really in great numbers. It was all Kansas, and it was all people from Missouri. It took a few weeks later until the folks from New England and Ohio started to come that were trying to make it a free state. And yeah, what you said, I mean, I don't have any statistics on this, but I'm based on everything I've read, I believe it's mostly uh, people migrating for political reasons. So this is very unique in American history that uh, you open up a new land and people are moving there specifically for one issue. Imagine something today, like say we gain new land, like part of Canada or something that wasn't settled, and they're like, well, hey, we can make this an area that has new laws that, or there's like one issue they're crusading on, or maybe let's just take a wedge issue like abortion. Oh, like this area, we are going to make it a pro-life state, and so we're all going to rush in, and all the people that are from the Bible Belt who are pro-life want to rush up
Well,
there and
there was actually kind of a issue with states were before the Supreme Court settled it. States were the ones deciding whether or not to legalize gay marriage, and actually, that was kind of the same thing with abortion. Abortion was legal in voluntary, or I think it's called elective abortion, was legal in New York and California prior to Roe v. Wade. Um, in fact, it was really contentious in New York because it was like completely legalized, and and that yeah, I could see like, oh well, we're going to admit Puerto Rico, so you guys have to decide if you're pro-life or pro-choice. Go.
But they already have a population there. Where in Kansas and Nebraska, it was just Native Americans for the most part. You had a
Yeah.
few, you had Fort Leavenworth, a
Yeah,
couple
you had
military outposts.
army and some old French traders and that, but like um and some fur trappers and whatnot, but like
Yeah,
eh. you
yeah.
know that's
Oh, Kansas was heavily settled by Native Americans. If you look at an old map of from the early 1850s, prior to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, you'll see all of the Native American reservations that were already set up. It looked like Oklahoma. It
uh,
looked like Oklahoma. It was like this
knowing better
second
pointed
Indian
out the
territory.
best issue: weed legalization.
Yeah.
That's how this kind of population influx would
Oh,
happen.
yeah. I mean,
But I mean, like, there's been a lot of like, think about Oregon and later on Washington, that became the first whites only states.
oh yeah.
And like, there was some contention in that vote, and there were like Californians going up there and going like, no, we want black people to be able to come in. Black people have been a huge boon here. We just don't like the Chinese. um, actually, it's something that's kind of interesting on that front. Is I recently was reading about urban segregation on on a global scale and how it was affecting the Western Ordinance in Delaware, and just kind of offhandedly said like the most advanced urban segregation laws in the country was in San Francisco, and I'm just like, what?
Yeah.
Like San Francisco was the most segregated place in America? What? And then you
Thanks
think,
to
oh,
laws.
it's Chinese. It's the Chinese. I mean,
Yeah.
there's still a Chinatown there.
That's
It's the
how it was
largest Chinatown.
designed. Yeah, it wasn't like self-segregation. It was
Oh no, that was
systematic,
by law.
legal. Yeah,
Yeah,
yep,
and that was ruled by the Supreme Court in like 1910 to be illegal, but I mean, it had already existed for 60 years.
yep.
Um, but
And now look at San Francisco.
it's a very interesting thing to see like these. Like I posted on Twitter recently about how South. I mean, Massachusetts was a leader in anti-alien laws, anti-immigration laws. Um, they would literally deport people if they were vagrants, and being a vagrant could be like anything. It was up to the officer who was arresting them. They just have some sheriff freaking walk up and there'd be a guy sitting on the street corner. He might have just been stopping to take a puff of freaking from his pipe or something, but no, you're a vagrant. You're going
Jeez.
you're going back to Ireland. Um,
Yeah, this is supposed to be the liberal bastion of American history, the Massachusetts, the most progressive state consistently, and you don't know about these things. Like, yeah, sure, they're against slavery. That's the abolitionist headquarters, but then they're doing crap like this. I mean, but hey, they were still ahead of
yeah.
the pack on most issues.
Well, it's like the Alien and Sedition Act, like that was basically designed by Massachusetts and New York. Um, like that's one of those things where it's like, um, maybe you have to go through the bad stuff first to get to removing the bad stuff first.
Yeah.
I
Well,
don't
and it makes sense because that was the Federalist hub as well. They were all about the central federal government, and I guess they kind of complemented each other. The Alien and Sedition Act, the
Mhm.
say, how, because what you're doing is you're putting the union of all of us young states in jeopardy by criticizing the
Which,
administration.
you know, speaking of constitutional violations and that, part of the thing in Kansas and Nebraska, kind of, Nebraska didn't matter by the end, but um, that there's also a constitutional limit on the size a state must be, in terms of population, before it is accepted as a state.
Right.
Which I think is like 60,000.
I don't remember off the top of my head, but that sounds right.
Yeah, I don't remember what it is, but there is one state in the union that violated that. Just
Alaska.
because somebody wanted some electoral votes. Can you guess which one?
Which state? New Mexico.
No. And New Mexico actually had already exceeded the population quota before, um, annexation. But no, it's Nevada.
Oh,
Nevada,
that makes sense. Yeah.
yeah, Nevada was actually below the population quota when it was accepted, purely because Lincoln was afraid of losing the upcoming election.
Okay, this is coming back to me. That sounds vaguely familiar. Oh, Nevada. I mean, when you have nothing there as far as natural resources, it's like,
Well, I mean, there was
I
the
know
Klondike load.
there was the precious metals, but I'm
I'm
talking
not.
about like imagine living in Nevada before air conditioning and before just
Oh well, we're talking about northern Nevada.
modern.
Southern Nevada didn't even get added to Nevada until 1867. Um, and you know, while it sounds like it sucks, it was actually pretty common for people to have like basically evaporative cooling. Um, they just drape a wet blanket over a window or something along those lines. Create a cross draft. It actually is a pretty effective way of cooling. In fact, I'm
Yeah.
living in a house right now that has evaporative cooling rather than air conditioning.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah, that closet you see behind me,
Yeah.
there is literally just a pipe sticking out at the top of it. That is where the evaporative cooling comes from.
Fascinating.
Yeah,
You
I
people
mean,
in the
obviously
deserts.
it's electric, but
Oh,
you,
yeah.
but like it didn't used to be. This house was built in 1941 and had cooling then. So,
Yeah. And the old refrigeration techniques before the refrigerator, like just
mhm.
always amazed me what they were able to do, like to make sure that food wouldn't spoil. It's crazy.
Oh yeah, and in Nevada it was especially crazy for around the. There was a huge boom in building in because of the Hoover Dam, and the dam site didn't have electricity for the first year. Um, Even though it's literally making an electric generation site. Um, but
Yeah.
you know, they weren't generating electricity yet, and it's 1932. Um, but they had ways of transporting a lot of water from the Colorado, so um, they had these like special boxes that were like, just chicken wire all around it, and you just drape wet cloths on the outside.
Yeah.
And they had like special things that they just slot in, and it was that easy. It was they'd go and get a truckload of wet cloth, bring it over, and plop it right into everybody's refrigeration units.
Yeah. Very nice. Ingenious.
Yeah, it works. It works quite well. It's you have to run over and wet the claws every day, but it's at least something.
And it's good to know for the upcoming apocalypse. So,
um,
shall we continue on the comments?
oh yeah, we kind of gone off on a wide tangent. Um, so yeah, we were talking about like how Texans were reacting to my video saying like, didn't even know about this. Like,
Yeah,
really, they hate us? I actually had one person who seemed to get really offended.
of course.
How can they be angry about a border dispute from 160 years ago? And it's like, well, it's a border dispute that was continuously violent for a century,
Yeah.
and it still informs a great deal of New Mexican politics today. Um, you know, I think they're pretty justified in being angry. Um,
Did you have anybody from El Paso watch the video?
yeah. There were a number of people from El Paso and Las Cruces who were commenting like, "Oh, that's why we're such rivals."
Okay. Yeah. Because I would think that people in El Paso would probably have that animosity there towards New Mexico.
Yeah, I don't think because I mean it's not like Texas really. It's not like New Mexico ever tried to invade Texas. It's
Yeah.
always the other way around. You know, New Mexico was the victim, Texas was the aggressor. Though, of course, they could get angry about the fact that New Mexico beat them every time. Like, you know,
Yeah.
we take over all of Mexico just to freaking make sure that we're holding the amount of Texas that we want to hold, and and then Texas tries to do the same thing with New Mexico, and New Mexico is just like, nope, we're going to
Yeah.
defeat the entirety of Texas.
Well, and it's definitely, I mean,
Texas did nothing wrong.
yeah. Well, I
forgot
find
the
it,
hashtag Happy 14.
and we need to make sure everybody knows that in Texas, if you grow up in Texas, you get I believe, an entire year of Texas history.
Yeah, there were some comments saying that actually.
Yeah, and
They were like, I had an entire year in the 7th grade and never heard about any of this.
exactly. And I don't know about New Mexico. I know in Kansas we have a semester in 7th grade. They get a semester of Kansas history, which some states maybe they'll get like a unit. So I'm
Yeah,
not sure about New Mexico, but that definitely
Nevada and California has it in the 4th grade, and Nevada gets a lot of its laws from California, so it's kind of that might be a possibility for another state rivalry. It's Nevada versus California, but the Nevada has only in the 4th grade do you get a state history, and it's the 4th grade. I don't remember a dang thing.
yeah.
They also have it in California, and like there's a major project that called the I think it's just called the Mission Project, that you make a mission model in class, like a model of one of the Franciscan missions. And that was a big thing, but now with all the fire and fury over Father Sarah getting his sainthood, people have kind of started to hate on the whole mission project thing. But yeah, there is clearly, even when you have a year of teaching this, people are not getting that at all. Which to me, like, how can you not talk about the Texas invasion of New Mexico during the Civil War in a Texas state history class?
Right. That seems kind of important, but so it kind of backs up the comments that where they were saying, "Yeah, we know nothing of this rivalry. What rivalry are you talking about? We don't hate them."
Well,
Obviously.
Grant is saying that it's either that you either visit a mission or you build a model of one.
Oh, okay, all right. Yeah, and I'm not sure. I think Missouri also has a semester, if I remember correctly. But I did have one comment I wanted to share about in terms of what they're taught in public school K-12. Let's see if I can find it, because I had one viewer that lived in both Kansas and Missouri.
I had a few people talking about like moving from Texas to New Mexico or vice versa.
Okay, yeah,
And a few of them were like, I didn't notice any rivalry. But like there was one who was like, like, um, saying, I think the quote is, I don't know if I can find it. I have a lot of the comments here. Um, but basically, um, it was, let's see here. That Tejano, and mind you, there's a lot of Spanish speaking folks here. That Tejano was like literally a curse word when he was living here, and in my experience, yeah, that's actually kind of true. It's like I was surprised at how much hatred there is of Texans here. Because like you think of like in Nevada, for instance, you hear freaking people, oh, freaking Californians. It's just like they're tourists, whatever. Here, it's like you're just instantly a bad person because you're from Texas. It's like, whoa, guys, that's the same kind of hatred you're blaming them for.
Right.
um, but when you look at the history of it makes sense. It makes sense why they have such hatred.
Yeah. I can't find the comment, but the comment essentially said that um, he learned completely different things in both classes. I never, my own experience learning about Quantrills Raid, when I learned about it in middle school, I mean, I don't remember a why or, like, oh, they just did it, like Quantrill just decided to gather up all these guerrilla fighters and just raid and burn the city,
Yeah,
he was just racist, or he was just trying to, he just hated them for, whatever. But apparently, the sacking of Osceola, which I didn't find that about that until college, much, much later. And this was actually just as devastating. Maybe the numbers weren't as high, but they did essentially the same thing. And that was James Lane, who was a senator of not state senator, like senator in U.S. Congress, and he led these raiders across the border. And then,
wait, was he a senator at the time?
No,
Oh,
no,
okay.
he actually was retired senator at that point, but still, they raided, they pillaged, there were cases of rape. They burned as many buildings down as they could. They killed civilians, and so a
Yeah.
couple years later, Quantrill's Raid, it's retaliation for Osceola, among other things. There's also a couple other events that uh, caused that to happen. So there's always a cause, and you don't get those causes, when you're learning certain curriculums. And it's amazing how even in 2018, 160, 170 years later, you can't get an objective account in the classroom. It's like they're pushing. It's kind of you see the problem with teaching American history. I've taught American history many years now, and of course, every single textbook almost out that you see is uh, designed to kind of prop up the American perspective that American exceptionalism is the underlying theme. I mean, I think throughout. I mean, you're not going to see a lot of Howard Zinn type stuff. You're going to see a lot of still okay. There's a few mistakes made along the way, but they're overall you're glorifying the American spirit and the values that we have as a country. You even see that at the state level, the way they teach these.
Oh, but it's like mandated. I mean, like Orthodox history is still just it has to be prominent in the classroom because, like they don't want well, like a revisionist history, like they especially don't want because it's going to be just teaching your kids that they're bad people and should be guilty of everything, and like while that's not actually the message, that's often what comes through because it's like, well, yeah, you are related to some pretty bad people. Um, like as I revealed earlier, I'm a Patton. Like like I had I'm related to Confederate generals. Like, um, that's that's like kind of a bad thing, but it's not like I feel guilty about it. And like, but that's what will come through if revisionist history is taught. People will feel like they have to be guilty of something, and that's the general critique of revisionist history. It's unfounded in any kind of reasonable understanding of the way history is told, because it's not about you, it's the story of us, it's all of us. But that's not what comes through to people who are looking to be offended.
Right. Yeah, that's an issue for sure because you do have lots of people that uh, they feel guilty. Like there's this. I mean, even the whole idea of white guilt. That's a. I think it's tied to how we teach history and how we think about history. And um, when you build a curriculum, I think you're trying to make it so the kids, the students, are becoming sort of detectives and historians themselves. Ideally, them to figure out the truth by looking at all of the sources. Trying to kind of create their own narrative, but because of time constraints and all this, a lot of times teachers are not. They're
Yeah.
just they're forced to spoon feed information, and by
Well,
doing that,
it's not just that. It's, I mean, there's a curriculum that is decided upon that teachers don't really have a say in.
right?
It's at the state level that they decide what books are going to be allowed. And um, Texas and California have a great. They're kind of like, everybody writes textbooks for either California or Texas,
Yep.
and they just um, give those books to everyone else. Oh, by
Yeah.
the way, that speaking of California versus Texas, there's a thing. There was a lot of Texan commenters who were saying, like, I think of our rivalry being with. I almost want to say it in a Texan accent. I'll think of our rivalry being in California, but like, the funny thing is, I wanted to comment back to every one of those things of just like, yeah, well, you want to complain about New Mexico being a one-way rivalry with Texas. You got another one-way rivalry with California. California doesn't give a damn about Texas.
California doesn't
California is
seem to
in a
give a damn about
rivalry with,
anybody.
yeah, yeah. I mean,
That's my
the only rivalry there is like LA versus New York, but that's a city rivalry, not a state rivalry.
yeah.
California is like just kind of off in a world of its own otherwise. Like, Nevada is in a one-way rivalry with California, and mind you, it's been violent. It's actually like there was an actual border war. I mean, not many people died. It was like, let's see here, there was the Pinecone Raid and the Sagebrush Rebellion. That's probably about 25 people dead. So not really that many, and we're talking over the course of like 30 years. But the California would just be like, yeah, what? There was fighting over there? Oh, there was fighting everywhere at some point. Oh well. um, and like so there's this really contentious issue between on the state line for Southern Nevada, where they put a bunch of solar towers. Those things where they have a bunch of mirrors all around the tower, and like focus all the light at the top of the tower so that it can like boil salt, um, generating electricity and all that.
Yeah.
But it's mirrors out in the middle of the desert, and they put it right up against the state line. I mean, like literally, the state line cuts one of the mirror sites off. There's 3 of them,
Really?
and yeah, and they did this basically in response to something that had happened earlier, where Mike Tyson had gotten caught stealing some sports stuff in Nevada, and he went to jail. But then he like escaped during that and like robbed a store or something like that. It was really weird. And then was grabbed by NHP, and Nevada Highway Patrol, and brought back. But California wanted to try him for like the robbery. And they were like, he's our problem, give us him. And Nevada's like, no, we got him, too bad. And it's like, okay, fine, we're gonna put a bunch of freaking shiny mirrors right on your border. So I mean, even now there is like this ongoing rivalry between California and Nevada, and most Californians are like, what? Who cares?
Yeah. Well, and that's another weird thing is like we know that, you know, in general, people that hate other groups of people, and even if it's a mild form of like, okay, we dislike other groups of people, they're taught that. It's passed down a lot of times. There are instances where it's, of course, it's over life experiences. People or they learn to hate a group of people or whatever. But the fact that rivalries in general, I think, you shouldn't just assume they're going to be carried down forever. I mean, I've already, like I mentioned earlier, the Kansas-Missouri rivalry has waned in recent years. A big reason why is, just because Missouri going to a different conference, and that's it. I remember
saw a lot of people talking about Michigan, Ohio,
yes,
and their thing, and I'm thinking like the Toledo War. Like, what else is there?
I had a really long comment about.
Yeah, I saw that.
Do an episode, yeah,
and it's. I mean, I didn't read all the comment, but the like as far as I know, there's really just the Toledo War. Like that one commenter that I talked about earlier that was like, oh, it's only 160 years ago that there was any kind of border dispute between New Mexico and Texas. It's like that's different because there was the Texan flood. There was also the Civil War. You know, there was actual violence going all the way into the 20th century, plus the differences in how we handle how New Mexico handles immigration and all that. Like these are still contentious political issues that drive things, but like, what is there for Michigan versus Ohio?
It's the sports rivalry. That's what essentially he was saying there. What that has kept it alive, and part of that is just how they've marketed the game every time they play. And they play because they're in the same conference every year. It's a guaranteed game. It's turned into a rivalry. The University of Michigan, University of Ohio State, and or Ohio State University. I have the comment in front of me. I mean, he talks about the Toledo War, which I knew you were aware of. You're pretty much an expert on when it comes to small wars in this country, but
it wasn't really a war. It was basically the two militias from the territories mustered, and at one point they actually did shoot at each other, and I think there was a sheriff who got injured. I might be mistaking that with the Honey War, which is like
that was Iowa, Missouri.
Yeah.
You want me to read his comment because he was very passionate.
Like, but it's mostly about the sports rivalry. Is there anything connecting the Toledo War to the sports rivalry?
No, like there's quite a bit of information here he added about. I mean, I didn't know any of this stuff. But he talked about Toledo, like the Northwest Ordinance, border dispute within that, the Toledo Strip, which contained the city of Toledo. There were no clear boundaries at the time, so Michigan and Ohio had separate surveys claiming Toledo. He says, "quote
just a bad legislation from Congress in terms of designating what the line was, so it actually put Toledo in an odd situation. It's kind of like what happened with the southern boundary for New Mexico, you know, prior to 1854." Between 1848 and 1854, there were 3 different survey lines kind of designating where the southern border would be. And that's kind of what the Gadsden Purchase was about, was solving that. Of course, La Masia got the short end of the stick on that one pretty bad. But La Masia was actually disputed territory during the 1850s, prior to 1854. Something I didn't get to put into the video is that um, Fort Fillmore was created in 1851, I think. Might be 52. And it was south of La Masia, basically claiming La Masia as American, even though it had literally been created as a refugee camp.
Oh boy! Wow.
Yeah, so it's kind of like there was the possibility of the Mexican American War starting up all over again because they started marching through the streets. Like Mexico sent, I can't remember the name of the general, but sent a general up there to march and say like this is Mexican territory. But then the guys at Fort Fillmore did the same thing, and like they ended up having to like sign a peace treaty because there was like a drunken brawl at a freaking at some guy's house because they didn't really have any saloons. But you know, Mexicans and Americans were literally fighting each other in like 1852, and they like over territory again. And it's like if somebody got shot, we could be looking at another war. And so the whole Gadsden Purchase, that's why Mexico knows it as the Treaty of La Masia, because that's what it was about, really.
Okay, so that's a lot. See, that's definitely a lot more than I ever knew, and I used to teach that every single year, the Gadsden Purchase, and it's just a little paragraph in the textbook, and
yeah, it's the Gadsden Purchase is one of those things that like oftentimes it's just kind of like, okay, well, it got done. But if you do a lot of Borderlands history, then it becomes really important because it was this really contentious thing that was kind of getting solved. It also meant that we didn't have to stop Comanche Raiders anymore, Comanche and Apache Raiders, which was which we were supposed to be doing by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo.
Yeah, well, and of course, then the reasoning that I've always taught about Gadsden Purchase that is listed in the textbook. Sorry, I keep referring to textbooks. This is really ugh. But anyway, it's
well, that's what you have had to deal with the most, and like it's a good thing of like testing what the general knowledge is supposed to be. You know, like what you can expect from a high schooler once they come to college.
Right. Yeah. So it makes sense, but still. So yeah, the official reasoning for the Gadsden Purchase was the Rocky Mountains being that natural barrier, so they're looking for a way around them for the railroads. And that's it.
That's even though that wasn't really it at all.
Yeah, no.
Like the railroad survey didn't get started until 1854. So, how could you be wanting to make a railroad through something if you haven't even started the survey? If you don't know that there is a barrier, then why do you need to circumvent a barrier you don't know about? That's actually not fact. Like teaching it that way is actually not factual. It's not based. It's what's a post hoc ergo hoc. Applying something that happened in the future to the past.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really just settling the border survey that was just not really working out, and fixing the whole Indian thing because we could not stop the Apaches and Comanches. They just kept on raiding.
I did know about the Apache attacks. But I believe that's something I learned later, and then also, but this seems like there's just a lot here that's missing. Like
yeah, well, it's one of those things with history is like you keep on digging and you'll find more and more complicated. The reason why I'm particularly well versed on southern New Mexico is that I'm working on a paper that might be published in the New Mexico History Review that is about a riot that happened in La Masia in 1871. And you have to remember, at that point, La Masia was the big city. It was the city. It was the county seat of Doña Ana, and Las Cruces did not become a big city until the railroad came in the 1880s. So, but the riot in 1871 was kind of the thing that started the population flux. There was literally people who went and founded another colony in Mexico because they were trying to be refugees. I don't remember what the sister city is called off the top of my head, but Asistencion is the name of the city. It's still there. It's still kind of considered a sister city to La Masia, but like it was founded from people who were fleeing the riot. So I'm actually like probably going to be published on this subject, so that's why
awesome.
I'm pretty well versed.
Very cool. Congratulations on that, by the way.
Thanks.
What were I don't want to jump too far ahead, but because I know we're still going through comments, but I think a lot of people were suggesting on my video future episodes we should do in addition to
I saw
Michigan
somebody
and
already
Ohio.
commenting over there about West Virginia, and like I know we had already talked about doing West Virginia as a follow-up, because somebody was like quoting Country Road.
Country Road.
And John Denver wasn't even from West Virginia. Like, I don't know where that comes from, but I've purposely stayed away from John Denver myself.
Well, that's the song he mentions, West Virginia.
Yeah.
Not a John Denver fan?
It's not even that I dislike his music, like on a like aesthetic level. It's more that my mom's a big John Denver fan, and therefore I hate it.
Yeah.
It's like I remember going to Aspen because of like John Denver festivals and that. Like we had one time that we went there and a tree had collapsed over the road and there was Pete Seeger just sitting on a frickin' on the tree playing for everybody who was stuck there.
Wow, that's really cool. Wow.
Yeah. I remember those trips fondly. I don't remember the John Denver stuff though, because I went and played in the skate park.
Well, we got a lot of the episodes we had been planning anyway got suggested. So some folks mentioned New York versus New Jersey. I got a couple for Texas and Oklahoma.
Yeah, I saw that, and like I know there's the whole Greer County debate, but I don't know. I just don't find it as interesting. Although there was the Bridge War. That was you know about the Bridge War?
It sounds familiar, but no, not the details.
Basically, there was a fight over like a county that is now in Oklahoma, called Greer County, and Texas built a bridge next to an old bridge, and then they like just basically fought over who would close the bridges. So like one of the bridges would be blocked on one side and the other bridge would be blocked on the other.
Oh,
and they had this
it's so
like
passive aggressive.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was apparently some shooting involved at one point, but nobody getting hurt or anything. But you know, like some sheriff shooting at another sheriff or something like that. Like, stop that!
Yeah.
You know, it's to me it just seems goofy as heck. But you know, it's not like any killing was going on.
Oh, then there's also the
but what
intrastate rivalries. Upstate New York versus basically New York
every
City.
state has an intrastate rivalry. I mean,
Yeah,
like I talked a little bit about it in mine about like northern and southern New Mexico.
Right. And California, Grant mentioned in the comments, like, look at the differences between northern and southern California or the Central Valley. And
I've actually done a video on that one.
That's right.
Yeah, are there multiple Californias? because that's the
He
thing.
has
Like
too.
California is, yeah. Grant actually made a response video, um, and there's a there's in California that's actually more of a rivalry than to any other state. Like the intrastate rivalries there are more important than state rivalries. But I can't
Right.
really think of any other place where that's the case. Even like New York, where you have a very big rivalry between upstate and and NYC, or basically anything south of Albany, southeast of Albany. Um, the the rivalry there is not as strong as the rivalry between New York and New Jersey. Um,
Yeah, and you see huge cultural differences like East Washington versus West Washington, and same with East Oregon versus West Oregon. Or you see it when, like Texas, it seems like there's uh, Dallas versus Houston. There's this, and I'll probably with my compared series end up doing a video for that. But in terms of actual like historical events that shape up those rivalries, it seems like more of a cultural based difference, or oh yeah, that's really what it is. It's
mhm.
cultural based differences, and so there's not really.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I have not done the research in order to say that there isn't some sort of historical basis, but it doesn't seem like that to me. I mean, look at the. A lot of people were talking about like Massachusetts versus the world. There's the ever-present term "mass holes." Um, I've I've got a what do you call that? Connecticutian, Connecticutan.
I have no idea.
I don't know. He's a kitten, um, but he's from Connecticut, and you know has some things to say about Boston.
Yeah,
uh, um, that like people in New England really hate uh, Massachusetts if they're not from Massachusetts. Although I think the biggest rivalry there is Maine versus Massachusetts, but that's partially because Maine was once Massachusetts.
yeah, no, that makes sense.
um, but I think the best one. I don't know about the. I got a lot of comments about Michigan versus Ohio,
Me too.
which which to me is like I don't know if there's really any story to tell there. But definitely West Virginia versus Virginia. There is a heck of a story there. Like Nevada shouldn't be the place called Battleborn. Like there was no fighting in Nevada for
Well,
the
the
Civil
fact that
War.
West Virginia even exists, I mean, that in
Yeah,
itself,
it's
it's
quite
a
literally Battleborn, and yet Nevada is the one that calls itself Battleborn. It's like
I
no,
didn't know
you were electoral vote born.
that. Thanks to Lincoln. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
but that's the state motto. Battleborn is. I mean, like even though I know it's a bunch of BS, like there's still that like Nevada heart going like Battleborn. Um, yeah,
Well, when I obviously we kind of get we are biased, and when we study something, that where we live, where it's where we live, we kind of lose sight of obviously the context of rivalries elsewhere, and so I just always assumed that this border war between Kansas and Missouri was like as crazy as it got between two states within a country. And so even some of your suggestions when we first talked about this series is like, oh, really? I didn't know there was that hatred there. That's crazy. And so I think one thing I had a hard time with when I made this video is, ignoring the fact that I lived most of my life in Kansas, and I want to get that full side of the Missourian perspective, and
yeah. I saw
it
that
was
there
tough.
was a comment who was like, "I'm tired of these amateur historians and their bias." It's like
Yes.
I see a lot of that stuff when somebody's complaining about bias. It's often just like you sound too liberal to me, and it's like, well, point out where I'm distorting the facts. You know,
Yeah, everybody has bias. I mean, but I think acknowledging your own bias, and then of course, I had a video that came out before. This is one of my first videos that I released on my channel. It was like 4 years ago or 5 years ago, and it was just about Quantrills Raid. And I did mention the sacking of Osceola in that video, and I tried to make it a little bit more balanced. But still, I got a lot of comments on that video. Well, there wasn't many comments, but the few that I did get were from Missourians. You could tell they're from Missouri, and they didn't like how I kind of left some things out, or I chose to kind of focus or embellish a little bit on the
Oh,
atrocities in Lawrence.
like I tried to make it clear that like the whole Texan flood thing was not the main source of violence in in the post-war postbellum period, um, because it wasn't. It was really just the Santa Fe Ring, that was like the main source of violence in um, the Wild West days of New Mexico, but which I've been studying a lot, obviously, but um, there is aspects that are still Texans moving in. Like if you look at Tularosa, the Tularosa ditch wars were straight up Texans versus New Mexicans, and I'm not like saying, oh well, there were a few people from Texas that were commanding the one side, and no, I mean like straight up, it was only Texans on one side and only New Mexicans on the other, um, and straight up violence between that range war took something like 30 lives. It's and then you of course have the Texan gangs, um, and what's really interesting is when you have somebody like Billy the Kid who straight up is supporting the Texan side, the Democrats during the Lincoln County War, and then because John Chisholm, a Texan, doesn't give him his due, it's actually not really clear what happened there. The Kid said that it was said that Chisholm hadn't paid him something due because of the Lincoln County War, and Chisholm's like, "Hey, I was trying to stay away from all that," and then the Kid just turns around and starts attacking Chisholm's personnel, killing them left and right. He was a nasty, nasty little kid, and he killed a bunch of people just because he perceived a slight from a Texan.
Yeah, and I just want to share with this comment I just saw on the chat. Somebody from outside of the United States. What do you say? Oh, to me, as an Austrian, these U.S. state rivalries seem to be just ridiculous and a sort of occupational therapy just because of boredom. And it made me think of when I lived in this town called Chanute in southeastern Kansas. They hated the kids over in Humboldt, which is a town that was even smaller. And like I only lived in Chanute for a year, and it was fascinating to me the hatred between these two towns that were about 15 minutes apart. And this is kind of like a microcosm, I guess, of what we're talking about. And this
people have a tendency to divide. Like in the army, for instance, you have a very clear division of like who's in what group because you literally have units, and that goes all the way down to the squad level. So like in a platoon, you're in a rivalry with the other squads, but then when it comes to your platoon, you're in a rivalry with other platoons, and when it comes to the company, you're in a rivalry with the company, battalion, regiment, freaking army versus navy, and
any institution. I mean, you've got corporate America is the same way. You can look at even our branches of government. The checks and balances seems to work not only with the three branches, the separation of powers, but also within each branch. You've got especially the executive branch, and I think that's a good thing that you have departments that don't get along, that where you have these rivalries between Department of Homeland Security and CIA or whatever it is, and like it goes back to tribalism. That's our human ancestors started out that way for hundreds of thousands of years, so it makes sense that that carries over to the present day. But how easy it is for us to just one little thing can just turn us tribal, can make it so that we're going to turn our back on an entire group of people because of that one thing, and how grudges, like what are those two families that fought for
Hatfield McCoy.
Hatfield McCoy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I avoided that show on the History Channel, but yeah, uh, that's also a great example of this, and I think it's fun to study. I mean, obviously, anytime there's conflict like this, and especially when you dig down and look at the absurdity of it. I mean, at least with Kansas, Missouri, you had the at least one side had this noble cause of ending slavery, and it does feel a little. I pat
There's
myself on the
actually
back that I
there's
live in the
an
free state.
there's an interesting thing on that where it was when I did my piece uh Brown, and
Yeah, we can
there were
talk
a few
about.
people.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so there were a few people saying, and like, remember Fuzzy Dunlop? I see him in my comments all the time. He could be quite incendiary. And Fuzzy, if you're watching, you need to tone down your language sometimes, man.
Not so fuzzy, are you?
Yeah, Fuzzy Wuzzy. But he'll sometimes have some pretty incendiary rhetoric that I have to either approve or actually delete. And there's been a few times that I've had to delete it because it was like, whoa, dude, no. But the and it's not even directed at me or anything. I mean, he's going after like other people in the comments, and that's not okay.
These are professional trolls. What you're saying?
No, he's not. He's just very incendiary with his opinions.
Oh,
But he was not incendiary in your comment section. Um, he said something like, "Well, I think that John Brown is a hero, and I don't think that the word terrorist is applicable here."
Right.
And I've definitely used the word terrorist to be hyperbolic. Yeah, I'll admit that.
Yeah.
But the worst word to use then was treasonous or traitorous or treacherous. There we go.
Treacherous. Yeah.
Yeah, like he's a convicted traitor.
Yeah. The law said he was a traitor.
Yeah, he's one of the few cases in which we've actually executed somebody for treason. Um, and that alone should kind of mitigate that stuff, because that means that like all the people who are saying like, oh, we can't have Robert E. Lee statues is like, well, then why do we have John Brown statues?
Yeah, no, I think, and I, of course, on Instagram, I posted a picture of myself next to the John Brown statue when we went to Osawatomie. I dragged my family around when we filmed for this video. It was a lot of fun actually going to the actual locations where these battles were fought. But I mean, John Brown in Kansas is still viewed as mostly a hero. And you look at the fact that there are statues of him around. There are roads named after him.
There's a road named after him in Haiti. That is I'm forgetting the name of the capital of Haiti. The capital of Haiti, its main street is John Brown Street.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, they named it in 1859, right after his execution.
Okay, yeah, so that makes sense. And when I used to teach 7th grade, I had a DBQ, document-based questions, where they looked at primary sources and tried to determine, okay, in your opinion, write a thesis. Was John Brown a hero or a villain? We do the same thing with Christopher Columbus, and it's a great exercise. But I think the bottom line is people, yeah, they forget when they call him a hero, they do forget the fact that if you were living back then, it would it'd be hard to see him as this saintly figure, because
Well, I mean,
that
there were plenty of abolitionists who did see it.
right.
I
You
mean,
mentioned
like,
you mentioned them in
um,
your
yeah, and Henry David Thoreau went well beyond what I talked about in
yeah.
the video. He wrote an entire like hagiography of John Brown. Um,
But that's Thoreau and these other prominent figures that
but you
did
have to think about who Thoreau, the person who
yeah
created the idea of civil disobedience,
yeah
the
yeah
the the person that the one person in the world before freaking Gandhi, that
yeah
literally Gandhi based his entire strategy on, and then later Martin Luther King. Those guys were basing it on this person, and this person was hailing John Brown as this hero.
Well, when I say prominent figures, generally are a little bit out of touch with your average citizen. The average citizens who are living in Kansas or Western Missouri, yeah, of course, like this guy was going around and just murdering people, him and his sons, and so they throw out whatever as far as the reason why he's killing. It's the fact that he's doing it makes him a terrorist because he's terrorizing. That's the definition of
Well, it's
terrorism is
also, I mean, like, he was trying to incite a race war. You know,
he was. Now,
you know what? Like, you know who else was doing exactly that?
a lot of people.
Uh, Dang it! Why am I forgetting his name? Now has like a swastika carved into his freaking forehead.
Oh,
Um,
Charles
the
Manson?
Charles Manson. Yeah,
Yeah,
Helter Skelter was all about that. Like,
yeah.
basically, Charles Manson was trying to do the same thing that John Brown was doing. Except for John Brown killed more people.
Well, and again, it's about what side you're on, right? And it's just like right now. Like right now, there's a dialogue back and forth. I was listening to the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, this morning saying that Iran is guilty of state-sponsored terrorism. And then Iran points its finger and says the United States is guilty of state-sponsored terrorism as well. You look at what's going on with Yemen or in
Mhm.
Pakistan. And so it's like, okay, it's about what side you're on. That's all it is. And then
Yep.
why Thoreau would all of a sudden like ignore his civil disobedience impulses and say, hey, sometimes it's necessary to just be violent for a righteous cause. Well, isn't that what war is? And sometimes, like World War II, I mean, that was all, yeah, like it was righteous. Many people argue to take down fascism and the Nazis. So uh, I think a
Well,
lot of it, if you're going to look at terms of violence in terms of values, um, there is a slippery slope. I mean, it's yeah, it's hard to be consistent on that.
yeah. I mean, it's one of those ones where you can't. It's like when you want to be against filibustering, right? Like that should be a pretty easy thing to say. No, filibustering is wrong. Like William Walker was wrong, and then it's like, yeah, but that was what John Brown was doing. And then it's like, well, yeah, filibustering ain't that bad. Suddenly it becomes a whose side are you on thing, not a like let's deal with the ethics of the situation.
Right. And
Because
you could
I mean,
even
John Brown was also responsible for a massacre during the Bleeding Kansas. Like that's like he lined up people and shot them. Like,
that you brought that up. I want to mention that I actually found the actual site for my video where that took place. This the Potawatomi Creek massacre, and there is no historical marker at all. It's a town called Lane, and that town is named after James Lane, that senator I was telling you about
oh
earlier,
yeah,
who was just as crazy as John Brown was.
oh
Um,
wow.
but yeah, I found it interesting that there was no historical marker there when a lot of these other places did have one. I had a really I had a hard time finding it.
Sounds like it's one of those things that were conveniently forgot. Um, you know,
Yeah,
there's a lot of that kind of stuff. I mean, like the thing with Texas not getting why New Mexico hates them is like it's because you conveniently forgot that you invaded 3 times.
yeah, yeah. Leave that out of that year-long course of Texas history, but I think we had a really good.
Well, we got a
Oh,
we got a super chat.
Emperor Tiger Star, yeah.
Hey.
Favorite
Thanks, man.
rock, metal, punk band for both of you. Very important.
uh, rock, CCR, metal, Sabaton, punk, Dead Kennedys.
Nice. I like your choices. For me, it'd be rock would be Radiohead, even though some people say they're not rock, man. Metal would be
Because it's
Pantera.
how
I
was
like thrash.
how was
And
Radiohead not rock?
well, you know how indie music snobs can be. And then so yeah, rock, Radiohead, metal, Pantera, punk would be well, do you call Green Day punk? Because it's more
And
punk pop, but I'll
in certain parts of it, I don't like the whole like they sold out thing, but like there's like up until basically American Idiot and back, um, punk.
yeah. Or
And
okay,
have you listened to some of their newer stuff? They're back to roots.
no, I haven't actually. I need to check it out.
Yeah, they released a anti-Trump album, so it's
That makes sense. They're back
pretty
to their
good.
roots after Trump gets elected. That's yeah, that's logical.
Yeah, it's weird because like I think American Idiot came out in like 2001, which means
2004.
oh really?
Yeah, it was 3 years after Bush. Uh,
Uh,
well, more or less. Yeah.
yeah, no, I would have thought I thought it was earlier and that they had gone through their pop phase, mostly because I think it is true. Most of their pop stuff was during Bush. Um, and you get an interesting thing with punk is that it's almost the opposite of westerns. It's like you get a lot of punk during during Republicans, and you get a lot of westerns during Democratic presidencies.
Yeah, I read that too somewhere. That's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it's that's I know for the punk thing that was all over things like Vice and everybody when Trump was elected that was one of the common things. Well, at least we'll be getting some good music. Um,
You certainly got it with I think with hip hop. I think some of the best. I think we're living in a golden age. I tweeted this the other day. Golden age of hip hop right now because in terms of not only
except for there's
production.
mumblecore.
Oh, that's I don't count that. I do not count that. I agree with
Well,
that. But in terms of like lyrics for many mainstream artists is actually refreshingly pretty profound. Like some of the most insightful and like it's kind of like comedians today. I think we're also living in a golden age with comedians because uh, they are so good at articulating what a lot of people are feeling, and so that's kind of what you don't go to like CNN to get that. You go to a comedian or a rapper to get really insightful social commentary, which is great.
yeah, I mean, honestly, it's YouTubers. Like,
YouTubers as well, yeah, like you, man, and like knowing better, and the Emperor Tiger Star, and Grant Hurst. Who else we got? Oh, M Laser.
I didn't see him laser.
Yeah, he
Really?
was on there earlier. E pluribus unum.
Oh yeah. Wait. Oh yeah, I see him. Remember when the Dixie Chicks did an anti-Bush song? Yeah. By the way, did you hear the song from what's their name? Pussy Riot. The Make America Great Again?
I didn't. I heard of the song. I have yet
Oh,
to listen to it.
it is don't watch the video. Listen to just the song. The video is kind of nasty actually.
Oh, really?
And
One
a
of the
little
musicians.
and way over the top. Just
Oh,
like tone it down, guys.
well, one of the musicians allegedly was poisoned by the Kremlin.
Really?
That's what they're theorizing, anyway. Yeah.
But she's
Uh,
dead?
no, they're alive. It was they are still recovering, I believe, in a hospital. One of the
It's got to be a she. They're all women.
is it? I thought there was a
They're all. Well, I don't know about the instruments.
yeah. I
So
think it was one of the actual. Let's see here. I'm looking it up. Masha. Guess no. That's a. Oh, yeah. It is a dude. His name is says Pyotr Verzilov.
ah,
But he's
okay.
yeah.
Obviously not part of the thing, but in terms of punk, you'd choose Green Day.
Or maybe Rancid. Yeah.
Yeah. Rudy
You like Randy
Soho.
Savage? Yeah.
Uh, their bassist is amazing. I didn't
Yeah.
even like, I play. Can you see that? There's a guitar in the background. There you go. See right there.
Yeah, mine too. Yeah, we still got to start that band.
I mean, I'm mostly a pianist, but the I picked up the guitar after coming back from Afghanistan, and like, so how when you know a particular instrument, you pay attention to that. And then I have a friend named he's not here, Daniel, who back in Slow, and he is a bassist and actually was actually a pretty toured with a lot of bands in that, and he started pointing out like bassists, and it's like opens up a whole new world of musical interpretation
Yeah.
when you find out like, oh hey, there's this whole dimension that you haven't even been paying attention to.
Yeah, it happens quite a bit. It depends. Yeah, a lot of times
Operation Ivy, yeah, but isn't like one of the members of Rancid from Operation Ivy, King Peppy?
Operation Ivy.
Somebody says David aerobics collab.
I think
That'd be great.
collaborate a lot. But no, I think my favorite bassist is probably Flea from Chili Peppers. I think he's kind of says he
Yeah.
set a pretty high standard.
Did
Anyway,
you
we're
already
talking
say your metal band pick?
Pantera.
Oh yeah, okay.
I don't listen to a lot of metal though.
That's pretty heavy.
Well, it's still, I call it thrash. So
Thrash. When it comes to thrash, it's always got to go with Metallica.
yeah, they're
Either that or Iron Maiden or
a lot of comments about Iron Maiden. I saw somebody asked about the new Michael Moore movie. Oh, shout out to Lindsay. I haven't seen it.
I honestly don't pay attention to Michael Moore.
I usually don't. He it's called, I think, 11/9 because he had, or Fahrenheit 11/9 because he had that Fahrenheit 9/11.
9/11, yeah. What's 11/9?
I don't know. I did see the trailer for it, but I don't know if
Either way, I've seen a few of his documentaries that he's worse than freaking Oliver Stone.
I mean, yeah, at least you know that going into it that it's like, okay, this is propaganda.
Yeah, it's annoying because it's like on the more conservative side, you have freaking you have ones that are just like everybody considers to be freaking wacky. Like what is it, like Sanjay Gupta or some Indian name that I can't remember, brought out a thing talking about like the left is a bunch of Nazis, and it was like literally an entire movie doing the freaking no, you're a Nazi, and like everybody just goes, yeah, stupid. But like when it comes to Michael Moore, then you have some people who take him seriously, and it's like, no, he's the same level of stupid.
Yeah, it's kind of lowest common denominator.
Deepak Chopra. Yes, thank you.
Oh, yeah. Oh, we got a good question about, okay, this is from Rory Kraft, this is from a ways up. He says, was there also some resentment between Arkansas and Kansas during the Civil War, or was that just an extension of the Kansas-Missouri conflict? From what I understand, from what I've read, I think it is mostly an extension from the Kansas-Missouri conflict. But I don't know enough about it to be a definitive.
Yeah, because I mean, you got like 40 years of separation between when they were actually playing each other. But yeah, I don't know.
I'm trying to see if there's any other questions here we missed.
Oh, I can go back to comments. The
Or no, I'm sorry, are we not doing that yet? Q&A?
Well, we've been kind of going back and forth.
Yeah, this has been a...
Let's see here. Here's a good one. So, in one point, I talked about basically Texans were white, and New Mexico was majority Hispanic, so there was a degree of racism involved.
Yeah.
And first of all, I had one person who was trying to say that, like, because I talked about racism, therefore I was trying to say that, like, all conservatives are racist, which is like, I don't even mention political persuasion during that section of the thing. So I that person was just kind of like, what the heck? Where are you coming from?
Mm.
But then there was another comment that was saying, like, well, Hispanics can be white too, and they're not wrong. Like, normally the term is non-white Hispanic,
Yeah.
or you'll hear non-Hispanic white sometimes when people are saying, like, I guess I should have said that, non-Hispanic white, but if I say Hispanics versus non-Hispanic whites, like,
Yeah, it gets a bit tedious. Yeah.
yeah, and plus, at the time, Hispanic was not considered, and they just used the term Spanish, but at the time, Hispanic was not considered white by most people, even though the census was required to call them white, and that's why you can't. So there's a weird thing about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that actually states that you have that that Hispanic people living in the United States at the time of annexation had to be treated as equals. They
Right.
had to have their land grants acknowledged and all that kind of stuff. That was all in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo.
It was broken many times.
Not exactly. Actually, it's pretty closely adhered to, but there's ways of, there's loopholes.
Yeah.
So it's not broken.
That's what I
It's
meant.
just bent to straining.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Especially when it comes to land grants. Land grants got really crazy. But actually, when it comes to just race, federally, Hispanics, it was until the, I think it was the 1910 census that the first time that Hispanic was even allowed to be a fill-in category. So literally, Hispanics were counted as white, no matter how dark their complexion. No matter how the term in Spanish for how dark you are is mestizo, how mixed with Indian. There's also mulatto, but like obviously mulatto is referring to black mixture.
Right.
But here we're talking about mestizo. That's normally what people think of when they think of like the Mexican race, which it's like that's a nationality, not a race. Come on, say Hispanic, say Latino, Latina. I hear people saying Latinx, which that the whole problem with Spanish is it has to be very gendered, so you kind of get stuck with saying Latino, Latina, Latinx. It just gets annoying. So that's why I say Hispanic, because it's gender neutral and has a lot of historical precedent, Spanish, and so that's one of the interesting things. Is like you can actually legitimately say it's like, well, the New Mexicans were white too. They were all Hispanic. That's white.
Yeah.
But not to the Texans. The Texans did not think that way, and that was the point.
Right. Yeah. I am always fascinated by that type of stuff because I know that these categories were created by the federal government with the idea of helping minorities get some kind of leverage like that. That was their intent, was to help certain groups of people marginalized in society. But there are unintended consequences with how we decide to label a group of people. And I think that's always interesting to me too. Like, well, labels change, and when you were just talking, it reminded me of one of my older videos where I call Native Americans Indians,
Oh, I
and
use the term Indian all the time.
yeah,
I actually basically refuse to use the term Native American because Native American actually refers like you and I are Native Americans. We are native to America. That is the actual origination of the term. It has been appropriated by American Indians, but you'll find most American Indians actually prefer American
Indian.
Indian. Yeah,
They
they
do, and I try to
don't
explain
say
this to people in the
Injun
comments.
like Injun is racist, but like
Well, obviously, but yeah, like I, I actually had friends who were Indian or Native American, and they said, "Yeah, we prefer American Indian. It's actually more respectful to us." And I was like, "Okay, so I guess Indian's okay. I don't feel guilty about using it." And yet, I had a video where I said Indian, and I got so many comments just trashing me and saying that I was racist for using that term Indian. And I know,
there's a trick to using the term. So, what I always try to do because I don't use Native American, I will sometimes just use Native, not
but that's,
Native
see, native is even
American.
more confusing to me. Like
Yeah,
just saying
well,
native, native to where?
well, well, it's for me. I always I always think of the natives are getting restless, but
Yeah,
like it only works for the first generation of Americans coming in. As soon as you have multiple generations, then it no longer makes sense to use the term native. Because then you have American natives,
yeah.
like, um,
It's a problematic term for sure. Like
yeah,
whoever
and
decided to use Native Americans.
the term Native American originates in the 1840s with nativism. Like that
Yeah,
Native American is specifically referring to anti-Catholic movements of the 1840s and 50s.
right.
Um, and nativism like we talk about nativism with our president in that, and that's still native dash American. So like it just doesn't make sense to use the term Native American, but like it's been so ingrained in people that it's racist to use the term Indian that you can't use it unless you do it in a particular way. And the way I do it is that I say American Indian first, and then for the rest of the time I say Indian. It makes it clear you're not talking about
Mhm.
Indian, from the subcontinent.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it. I think I'm gonna do that from now on.
That's what I was taught. It's just it's an easier way of doing it. Um, that was actually taught to me by an Indian Paiute, but um, the
All right.
actually Paiute and Navajo had like Navajo parentage as well. Um, gets weird, especially when you look at the northeastern Arizona. There is actually a reservation in northeastern Arizona of Navajos who are surrounded by like Kokopah or like Hualapai or something like that, and then like another tribe surrounding that, and then Navajo. So it's like a reservation within a reservation within a reservation within a reservation.
That's so weird.
Yeah, it's
How those treaties were created.
I have no idea. I've not done the research on it. Navajo history, basically after Bosque Redondo, I don't really know.
Hmm.
And like Bosque Redondo is enough to know about.
Yeah.
Like actually one of the interesting connections and one of the interesting things I'm surprised I didn't get any comments about is like, why aren't you talking about Indians? Like I talk about the
I
Comanche a little bit,
Yeah.
and
Well, it seems like a lot of my videos, they get token reference because I feel like, okay, a lot of times I'm referencing things within the last 200 years, and so their story seems to be winding down at that point, and and it sounds horrible because it's like you're ignoring, entire nations of people. But at the same time, for practicality, again, it's like you're focusing on one specific group of people.
Yeah. Well, it's also like, sometimes telling a story requires you to rule out things out of the narrative. I know,
Right.
like, the thing I've studied the most in terms of Las Vegas history is what were called the Renegade Indians, Mwawich, Vote, Mouse, and Kehoe. And when I did the history of Las Vegas episode, I I didn't write about them at all. Like, they don't enter the story whatsoever, even though it's literally the thing I've studied the most. But that's kind of just the nature of the beast when you're trying to tell one story and like there's something way over here that you really like, but you can't weave it in.
I left out characters in my Kansas, Missouri video. My diehard, fellow Kansas history geeks. I posted the video on a group on Facebook, and they're like, "Oh, you could have mentioned this guy or this guy," and like, yeah, I mean, it was a 17-minute long video, so you have to leave some things out. However, I did feel like I was surprised that it ended up being 17 minutes. And I think part of that is the fact that I've taught this for so long. I already know a lot about it. I've read so much about it that it's
You
like,
could streamline it better.
yeah, part of me is like, well, it's good that I actually spent more time on a subject that I know a lot about and I care a lot about. At the same time, uh, I had people who were like, "Oh, I'm not going to watch this whole thing because this is just like a petty state rivalry that."
Oh, by the way, I just wanted to point out e pluribus union and unum means union, but and knowing better, both on our previous conversation about like racial terminology and that.
Yes.
Point out a couple of things. First of all, American tribesman is actually like something to be avoided. You don't want to say tribesmen. You want to refer to them by their actual tribe, but realize sometimes they're not really a tribe, like the Pueblos here. Pueblos are more cities than tribe. They're urbanites. And yeah, it gets weird because they're not organized as that, but we call them tribes because of past, but like because that's their official term, then you can call them tribes, and it gets really weird, as you can tell. And also, there's like levels within a tribe. You have tribes and band is the normal separation. Is you have the Apache tribe, but then you have the why am I forgetting the Mescaleros or the Chiricahua? That's the most famous one. Yeah, the one down in southeastern. Used to be in southeastern Arizona, and the those are called bands, but like they themselves might actually refer to Chiricahua as a tribe. So yeah, it gets really confusing, and if you just say tribesman, it's kind of a blanket term for a political organization rather than a race. And if you're trying to refer to them by race, then it's better to use the term American Indian.
I've never even heard any history teacher ever use that word, tribesman.
Yeah, you won't, because it's confusing.
Yeah, a lot of this is, and I think if we were just in every single one of our videos say this person who was living with this group of people, it would get tedious, but maybe that would be the safest way to always describe a person as part of a group instead of it's like putting the individual first, just like a kind of you see with a movement now of somebody who has a disability or somebody who has autism is a great example of this. Like, I think it's more politically correct to say
is half Cherokee, apparently, part Cherokee.
Oh, cool, nice. But like as somebody who has autism, they are a person on the spectrum or a person with autism. They are not autistic, And I think
Uh,
I understand
I know
where people are
my
coming from.
cousin is autistic, and like
See,
everybody refers to him as autistic.
yeah, that's
And
very
I
common.
have a autistic. There's an autistic student in one of my classes, and he refers to himself as autistic.
Right, yeah. This is, of course, me going to a couple conferences and with
Yeah, well,
special
that's one of
education.
those things where you get a group of people who want to decide what's right, rather than, just organically coming from language.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Well, I
I've
think that's
seen that a lot. That's why, like, you'll get people who will be like, "No, it's Native American,"
isn't that
and
the root cause of why people, why political correctness, I mean, a lot of it exists is because of a small group of people that says, okay, this is going to be probably the term that's least offensive. Whereas you look at like the Redskins, the Washington Redskins, of course, that being controversial, their mascot, the name of it, and then they conducted some surveys and they actually asked American Indians, like, what do you think about this? And the vast majority of them had no problem with it. It was the people that were not American Indians that tended to be more against it. So I find that, yeah, like what you said, if it's more organic, if it comes from the people themselves, like we don't want to be called this,
yeah.
that seems much more logical to me.
Well, it's also like language evolves. It's not a static thing, and you have to deal with the etymology, the history of the words. You don't get to just make up words. That's not an effective way to create language. Um, Germans have this down pat. They, instead of creating new words, they just go, "I like this word. I like this word. This word has nothing to do with it, but screw it." You know,
Hmm.
that's how they make new words. It's just slapping words together. Um, but the
Yeah,
it's really annoying.
it is. It just it's hard to keep up with everything.
Yeah, and the if you are doing some sort of focus group to determine what is correct language, like AP News does this all the time. They have like an entire
Yep.
book on like what is the proper
Oh,
thing,
I
and they
come
want.
from the J school. I'm very well aware of
Oh
the
yeah,
book.
I
Yeah.
forgot about that. Yeah, and like they're the ones who are propagating the whole thing of like Native American is the correct thing to say, and it's like, no, nobody wants this. It's just a group of people sitting in a room deciding this is offensive now. Um, that's not actually causing offense. You've decided to. Like I remember when I was reading what was the article? It was something like um, the Jewry of African trade in the Renaissance or something like that. And
Sounds riveting.
it it actually was pretty interesting. It was talking about how these small groups of Jews were, you know, able to control large amounts of trade in North Africa and South Africa, and
Hmm.
as such, were able to connect their trade relations together with the French, so that they had a trade network through Africa, despite being a massive minority. They were able to coordinate across space, even because most Africans couldn't. They didn't have a unified language, but with Hebrew, they could. Um,
Huh, fascinating. Yeah, that is.
yeah,
I think I would like to read that.
it's a. I could send it to you. Um, but I remember reading that and just instantly being like, Jewry? That can't be a proper way of it's Judaism. How what? How is this published in an academic journal?
Even the word Jew sounds bad sometimes to me.
Yeah, well, especially if you put the Jews. If especially if you put that article in front of it, then it's like saying the blacks, the
Yeah.
Indians. It's not the blacks, the Indians, the Jews. It's Jews, blacks, Indians. Not it's whites. It's not the whites. Um, you know,
The humans.
Yeah. It's. I mean, think about it. When anytime you hear somebody say the Americans did this, it's never in a good context.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You put that article in front of it, it is diminutive.
Yeah.
But without it, it's not. So it's an interesting conundrum.
We got a lot of good comments here. I'm just starting to look back. We've had multiple people. It's Springles says, "Cipher, why are you so damn sexy?" So I just want to let you know. But a lot of people comment about like that that they are autistic. They say they don't mind being called autistic. So
Yeah. I've whatever you do, don't say the N-word.
Yeah.
Um,
King Pepe always has great comments. I've seen people try to divide the world to simplify it to create clear rules. Understand why you want, but it leads to nothing good. Please believe me, humans.
I am not seeing that comment.
Oh,
Is it because I have it on top chat? Apparently, I need to have it on live chat.
mine's on top chat too, but
Okay.
I need to switch it. Well, we never said whether or not John Brown was a terrorist or a hero. So
Yeah, we didn't.
my I polled Twitter, and the majority of Twitter says he was a hero.
I remember that poll. I remember also. I actually voted negatively.
Yeah, there was like 60 some votes, so
Yeah.
not very comprehensive. But
I voted negatively because I also knew. I mean, you know where that poll's going. It's going to say hero.
Yeah, could have worded it differently, probably.
Well, it's not just that. It's like people will choose their side. You know, to me there are no heroes or villains. You know, there's people doing stupid things for sure. John Brown was doing a lot of stupid things.
I think I think in absolutes you're right, but I think we can still have our conversations about, were they more of a like on the spectrum of hero to villain? Are they more towards the hero side, more towards the villain side?
Well, I think a lot of the time on that stuff is it's an unproductive conversation to have. You know, maybe a conversation about like what makes a hero in people's eyes.
How is that? How is that something different though? Like,
what makes a hero as opposed to whether or not they are a hero?
If we want to know what makes a hero, we have to look at examples, right?
Hero is an absolute category that we have, that is not a constructed one, and one that is constantly in flux, which is the truth.
Oh yes. Oh, nice. I like where you're taking this. Yeah. See, like, I guess thinking more concretely, like when you have a philosophical discussion about what it means to be a hero, I just naturally gravitate towards these figures, like throughout history. But yeah, like you look at, if you contextualize it, then for sure it's going to be relative. So you know, talking about this, I do see your point, because how can it be productive if everything is so radically different in 2018 than it was in 1859? You know, so in terms of not just, I mean, just every aspect of society, it's like almost like a foreign world. So I think what you can do though is you can look at characters, contemporaries, you know, of the time, like.
Well, there's a whole realm of historiography that is looking at myth. My favorite is Richard Slotkin, but in terms of hero worship, hold on, let me figure out what the actual name of the author is.
While he's looking, check out my channel, Mr. Beats. It's all right.
So
thank you for watching.
The Great American Outlaw, by Frank Richard Prassel. That's it. You know, like literally has a picture of John Dillinger on the back. But he looks at the archetypes of these things, never judging himself, That's the point. As a historian, you don't get to do that.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get to pronounce who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. That's for
Right.
the reader to decide. But what's especially interesting is looking at what people thought of these figures at the time and forward, how their myths developed. Because when we're talking about heroes, we're not talking about like, was this person's actions objectively good? No, there is no such thing as objectively good.
Right.
And and what was considered, and even like what was considered good about these heroes can change over time too. It's not like good is a static category either. But so we're talking about mythology, not reality. How their myths developed, and studying myth is a how myths surrounding historical figures is a big thing. I mean, that's basically what I do with based on true stories, right? Like that's studying mythology.
Yeah.
Trying to fight it a bit, but like doing some myth busting, but
Do you think it's completely counterproductive to really spend any substantial amount of time studying just figures in history, like
great
uh,
man history, you mean?
yeah, great man history? Like I know you tend to not be a fan of that, but is there any value in that?
Well, I mean, like great man history was overdone for a long time. It was like, well, first we're just going to talk about all the presidents, and then maybe we'll talk about some social leaders. Never talk about the people as a whole.
Because that's not as interesting, right? Isn't that a big reason? You want to inspire
It's
people, you want to motivate them
it's
to
a lot
learn more.
easier to make interesting. I'll
Yeah,
say that. It's
yeah.
it's easy to focus on a singular character, and if that character is already well known, then it's that much easier to get people's attention.
Like the movie Lincoln, which is really about the 13th Amendment, about how the executive branch and legislative
Yeah,
branch work together
most of
to.
that is fictional, though.
Right. Obviously, they took liberty at making things up, but as far as like
Most of the movie.
the movie itself isn't about Lincoln.
Yeah, it's
It's
about the trouble of getting the 13th Amendment passed.
yeah, but how many people would watch a movie called The
13th.
13th Amendment? Yeah.
Well, there
Right.
was just one on Netflix called 13th.
Oh, I heard about that.
Yeah, it
But
wasn't
see,
about the
didn't look.
it wasn't actually about the 13th Amendment at all. They were trying to make
Oh,
it sound like prisoners were slaves. That typical rhetoric of people who don't know how to read. The thing with that, I shouldn't go off on a tangent there. I've already addressed it on the channel before. That's not what the 13th Amendment says. It doesn't make an exception for freaking prisoners to make them slaves. It's saying that you cannot use the 13th Amendment to free prisoners. That's what it says. Figure it out,
oh,
people.
they're basically extending the
Yeah,
interpretation. Okay.
I mean, like if you look at the box art for the 13th thing, it literally shows like somebody running in like pinstripes. I mean, not pinstripes, prison stripes.
Prison stripes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and like the flag is like prison stripes. Typical thing. But the fiction of that's what we were getting at in terms of like hero worship, and that is built upon fiction, not nonfiction. Even though we talk about these based on a true story things, we talk about John Brown, body lying in a grave, moldering in a grave. Like we have songs commemorating him and all this other stuff that like, but that's not about him. That's about an idea of him.
Yeah.
and when you get to that level of abstraction, you can do what like Prassel, oh, I just hit myself, what like Prassel did, where, or Slotkin or Guard, wait, Guard? Oh, dang it. Whoever wrote Virgin Lands. These are towering figures in the study of American myths, and they are not looking at them to say this is a hero and this is not. They're looking to find out what people thought was a hero.
Right.
And nice thing about Slotkin and Prassel is they go straight up into Hollywood history. Like they're looking at like, you know, this thing has an entire discussion about the Billy the Kid myth. It's actually why I got it in the first place. The you know, Billy the Kid, what most people think of him is not at all close to reality, but that's not the point.
Right. I think Hollywood, you brought that up, it has been guilty for such a long time, basically since Hollywood became a thing, of creating that dichotomy of the hero and a villain. And only recently, I think, probably 10, 15 years, you've seen kind of a change where you do have multifaceted characters you can't just fit into a category, especially in television. And you even see superhero movies these days there where even the superheroes have these major flaws, and you're just like, oh, who really is the good guy? And I think that's good. I think we are, because a lot of times that's all people are seeing are superhero movies. They're not reading books, and so it's good to see that. Yeah, it's not so black and white. It's mostly just gray. And I think I can't stand when I hear that word evil, like this, and fill in the blank is evil. Like the older I get, the more I hear that I start to cringe, because it's like, what do you mean by evil? You mean it goes against your values as a person? That's really what it means.
I mean, I think I've made it pretty clear that I like Nietzsche.
Yeah.
And we really do need to get beyond good and evil. Like that, we need to step beyond those bounds in terms of our analysis of historical figures. It's more about what do we want? What are our values? And how do we emphasize, how do we derive those values from the past? How do we learn from the past to get to the values that we want to achieve? And that has nothing to do with good or bad. Like, that's just, well, we want to be a more powerful country, so what's worked for us in the past?
It helps tribalism that we talked about earlier. Nationalism, tribalism, it goes back to the us versus them. It helps that. It doesn't help humanity. And when we talk about really the overall purpose of studying, I think history, all of history, is we want to learn lessons to preserve our survival as a species. We're not studying the history. I mean, it's a humanity. We're not studying the history of elephants. No offense, elephants.
By the way, Nevermore says, do I think Buffalo Bill is more guilty than Hollywood? It's just that he came before. It's not that he's more guilty. After all, he was the one like trying to promote realism more than Teddy Roosevelt was. There's the holy trinity of Western myth, the Turner, Teddy, and Buffalo Bill. And they obviously set the ground for Hollywood, but Hollywood turned it into a production model.
Yes.
They weaponized the Western myth to make money.
Yeah. We only have I have 15 minutes left here.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we should try to do some more Q&A.
Yeah.
Or any other comments you wanted to hit?
Let's see here. I don't see many questions. Any questions, guys? And you only got about 15 minutes left.
I did want to share one more comment I got on my Kansas Missouri video. Somebody commented, and I thought this was something I didn't catch, that I didn't know about. There is still a lot of violence today. The Missouri People's Liberation Army routinely kidnaps innocent Kansas citizens of all colors. Kind of like goes into graphic detail about what they do.
Oh, I remember that.
And I was
And
like, "What
it
the
was
heck
like,
are you talking about?"
yeah,
Uh,
that one was like, I tried to search what the heck the guy was talking about, and
and
no.
yeah, and no, but see, I think this comment kind of shows that uh, this there is still some bad blood between the two states, and I think if you think of the burnt district in particular, like the three counties along the border of Kansas and Missouri. If you look at those areas, their economies were behind all of the other surrounding areas for generations. So you have people that are living in poverty, people that are struggling to get by, and it's directly linked to the fact that all their property was just destroyed, like land value gone. And so much about what's passed down from generation to generation is how we pass our wealth down for future generations. And if you tell those stories of this is what happened and this is why we are still struggling to this very day, 160 some years later, I think I do see it, that I do see direct links. And so I don't see it with other rivalries as much. I'm hoping to learn more, and I know we wanted to do this series for a while, but I wonder how many actually are going to be uh, other than obviously West Virginia, and that's a pretty good one. But how many episodes do you think we can keep this going?
Oh, there's always something. And
We could
you
also
learn,
go to. Somebody mentioned Canada too. They said, "Well, how about Quebec?" You know, looking at battling with the rest of Canada and stuff like that. We could go to other countries too and look at that. But
yeah, I feel like I'm not really. I mean, maybe with Mexico I can do some stuff, but only northern Mexico. Talking about like Sonora versus Chihuahua. Um, but like, I don't think there's as much of a demand for that, to be honest.
yeah,
That's the other thing. You gotta make a episode that at least is somewhat appealing. Most people wouldn't even know the difference between Sonora and Chihuahua, or like Baja and Baja Sur. Um, it's it's a it's you know a place that's not as well recognized, whereas like everybody in the world
well,
deals
most
with America.
that's the
And
thing. We mostly have American history content on our channels, and I
well,
feel
I'm an
like
Americanist, like, and so
yeah,
are you. Like,
yeah,
that's what we study.
it's what we study, it's what we teach. But also, like most of my viewers are already like I think it's about 79% of my viewers are
Well,
American.
here's a good question that we can go on
Okay,
for
yeah, let's
10
do the
minutes.
questions. Yeah, let's do it.
Um, does the U.S. need more states? Um,
Yes,
mhm.
I think
Yeah,
so.
and somebody earlier asked, like, do the big states need to be split? Yes.
Yes.
California has a referendum on that right now.
It's not going to get passed though.
Yeah.
Well, the I
But at
think
least, like, unlike the last one, this one seems, it's, first of all, it's only 3 states that they're proposing. Um, Second of all, they're not splitting up the Central Coast, and that was the big deal breaker for me on the last one. I could actually vote on the last one. But the it wanted to split the Central Coast, and it's like, no, no, you don't get it. Like, you don't get to put Monterey and San Luis Obispo in a different freaking state than Santa Barbara. Like, that's a no go. Like,
yeah.
that is the Central Coast. That is the origination of California right there. Like, Monterey was the creation of California. You don't get to split it off from its constituents. um it's one of those ones where it's like the last one was supported by people who would benefit from it, but then fundamentally misunderstood the actual geography of California, which this one doesn't do so much. It basically puts the coast on one and then like splits northern and southern on the non-coastal parts.
Mm.
Although I think San Diego is not part of the coastal opposition. But that would be two new states right there. Splitting up Texas has been a popular thing, was really popular in the 1860s. And Puerto Rico, like I get that having a state government is expensive, but I think if they were a state, we wouldn't be facing what just happened with the hurricane as much if they were as a state government. States can request FEMA, territories can't.
Yeah, it's I think that was a big eye opener, and the issue with Puerto Rico still remains that it's largely a political battle, because we probably know that they would be a democratic state, which means more democratic representation in Congress. Also, Puerto Rico has a large amount of debt, which complements, I guess, the rest of the country's debt really well. But do we really want to add that debt? That's going to be an argument. And the fact that it would be the 51st poorest state in terms of GDP, and I mean, Mississippi would look pretty good compared to Puerto Rico.
A bunch of aid that would be available to Puerto Rico as a state that isn't available as a territory. We don't really have the same kind of territorial power, the ability to grant power to territories that we once did in the 19th century. New Mexico functioned as a territory from 1850. Wasn't really a territory in 1848. It was a military district. But from 1850 to
1910? No.
1912.
1912,
yeah.
It's a long time.
Yeah. And they voted Wilson.
Wilson?
But they were a territory for an extremely long time. Speaking of Wilson, Wilson's the one who made Puerto Rico a proper territory. And that was putting it on the same level as Hawaii and Alaska. And like those became states, and look how they're doing now. Alaska was dirt poor. Like puts what's happening in Puerto Rico to shame in terms of just how poor they were to begin with, and doing well now.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're up in like Barrier or something like that, yeah, there's some problems up there, but you're kind of also living above the Arctic Circle. So
Barrow, yeah. Knowing Better had a good point as far as he says splitting up states is just
gerrymandering. Yeah, I saw that one.
Gerrymandering, yeah. Gerrymandering, I think, is one of the most important issues right now that has to be addressed in terms of representation. It's
the thing about
can you think of another time in American history where the people were not represented than today? Since I feel like there's a large percentage of Americans that just feel like they're not represented.
1992. Anytime you've had a split vote, you have a third party that came in and kind of ruined everything. You can look at 1860, 1898, 1912. These are.
I'm talking more in terms of of Congress. I mean,
Well, Congress. Yeah. I mean, we didn't have. There just wasn't the technology to do the kind of gerrymandering that is done now.
Which means that there's the kind of technology now also to prevent it from happening. I mean, math is
Oh, but that would
involved.
actually require the people that it benefits to vote against
Yeah.
that they're benefiting from.
Yep.
But I
Yep.
mean, like the term gerrymander comes from a really crazy gerrymander, and it's from like his.
Elbridge Gerry. Yeah.
Except for it's actually Gary.
Oh, right. Sorry. That's why I always mispronounce his name. Yeah.
We call it gerrymandering, but his
Yeah,
name
but
was
it's
Gary.
actually Gary. You're right. Yeah.
But then again, like I can't say John C. Fremont. I say John C. Fremont. Like
I say
that's
Fremont too.
yeah. I
And I
can't.
say Carnegie instead of Carnegie.
Yeah.
Come at me, bro.
Actually, I have a friend who's related to Carnegie, and he doesn't even pronounce it correctly. um. So
Okay.
um. So we're getting close to time here. Um. But I do want to say I don't think that splitting up states is gerrymandering. It's not really at all. It's if anything, it's being able to build up more representation. In fact, that's kind of what the issue is with California. Is
If you
that
can
you have
localize it, then
you have huge swaths of California that are very red, and yet California is a deep blue state. It's actually about taking away some of the gerrymandering. So it's not gerrymandering now, because if it were, we'd see it being done with political maps rather than what territory has more affinity. Like the whole thing where I was talking about, like, you can't split up the Central Coast. It's not about like what side the Central Coast votes on. It's about cultural history. You can't split that up. Like that's just like they cannot be split up.
yeah, like they were in the Middle East. The British and French. Yeah. Oops.
All right, so do we want to try to answer one last thing, or do we want to call good?
Oh, I probably better get out of here.
Yeah, it's getting close to time. So guys, we're gonna
Sorry.
call it quits. Unfortunately, it still says that we're off the air. I think we just have to hang up. Because like whatever. So the video is going to go down until it like processes and everything. So
And we're going to continue this series. So
yeah, and hopefully I want to do more regular live streams like this.
yeah.
So Brent was here earlier. I'm planning we're going to be doing a collab fairly soon, and I hope to bring him on to this as well.
Great.
And Matt, I got to talk to you afterward.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, not in front of everybody, huh?
All right. So see you guys later.
Bye.